today's topic is getting the most use out of statuses throughout pipeline. And I know a lot of times we'll mention the importance of setting your transaction statuses up properly, because they just drive everything in pipeline, the entire life cycle of your transactions. But we don't typically go too deeply into those because you're usually already set up with those and those are working fine for you. And we don't go too deeply into that setup process. But today we're going to touch on a few useful tips or techniques that will help you improve the workflow, save time for your team. It may involve tweaking your statuses if it's appropriate for you, or it could just involve how you use the statuses that already exist throughout pipeline. So let's dive on over to pipeline. Okay, so we cannot talk about these custom statuses without mentioning basically that setting them up cleanly will set you up for basically saving time for everyone that actually uses the transactions, whether they're reporting on them or entering them, etc. So can't emphasize enough how important it is to set those up cleanly. And by cleanly, typically the biggest area where we find there's an issue is people commingling their statuses with their transaction labels or with their sides. In other words, here's a clean list of some transaction statuses here, which I'm sure you already know you can customize. Sometimes we'll see people who will commingle, let's take a look at this example here, commingle their statuses with their with the type of transaction it is or the transaction label, right? So here, instead of saying pending, they're saying pending for a commercial listing or for commercial property, pending for a condo, pending for a duplex, etc., right? Instead of just pending. And the reason we recommend not doing that is because, one, we've got a completely different field for tracking the label, namely the transaction label, where you would put commercial or condo or duplex, etc. And that keeps your status clean. That way, every time a transaction is going through its life cycle, its different statuses, and you need to change the status on a transaction, all you have to do is select pending. You don't have to determine, oh, is it a commercial or a condo, etc., and put it in pending. You just say pending, right? And same for listing or listed, closed, etc. Right? So that's commingling your labels with your statuses. Definitely don't recommend that. It makes it harder every single time a transaction status changes. Likewise, sometimes we'll see where they commingle the status with the type of transaction it is. So a buyer or seller, right? Or which side of the transaction that they've got. So instead of just being able to say under contract, you've got to determine that I've got the buyer side or the seller side and specify that as well every time you change the transaction. Not that that's difficult, but again, more clutter, unnecessary if you just say under contract or closed, etc. Right? So here's one where you can see it's a lot more clean. I can just say under contract, I can say closed, etc., and not worry about whether I need to determine what side of the contract I have every time the status changes. So definitely recommend setting those up cleanly, makes it less cluttered, easier system to use, etc. Successful all around. Okay, so that's the first thing. And also making sure that you put your statuses in the correct category, right? If you've got a status that you're done with, right? It's closed or it's fell through or it's expired, etc. Put them into one of these closed categories. That'll mean that once it goes into one of those categories, it will no longer appear on that default list of active transactions, which is when you go to the transactions page. Let me open that in a separate tab here. When I go to the transactions page, it's only showing me active status, transactions with active statuses, right? So make sure if it does still need to be active, don't put it in one of those. If it is inactive, you don't want it to show on those lists, put it in one of those. And also when it's inactive, keep in mind that's going to trigger the system to back it up in next month's backup. So another cue as far as which status a transaction status needs, which category a transaction status needs to go into. Okay. All right, so that's setting them up properly. I'm sure you've all done that, but just wanted to make sure because it does impact for the life that you're in pipeline here. Next, wanted to talk about how your statuses can help facilitate other things. Let's start with checklists. So head on over to a checklist here. When you're setting your checklist templates to be automatically assigned to transactions, you've got a few different metrics that you can use to help determine that, and one of them is your transaction status, right? So you can say when a transaction goes under contract, and it's a residential contract for, a residential transaction, for example, right? Using your label there. And maybe you've got the buying side, then you can set up this particular checklist to be automatically assigned based on those criteria, when they go into those criteria, right? So your status is critical in that. That typically drives most of the times when your checklist gets automatically assigned. So setting those up properly will help make that happen really efficiently, okay? So status is definitely a huge trigger for that, or help for that, to use those as triggers. Also, heading back, just looking at our statuses here. Also, your statuses can help drive, let me back up. We integrate with Zapier. Zapier is a third-party tool that allows you to connect different systems, the data, and transfer information from one system to another. We connect with them by allowing you to send data from Pipeline to another system that also uses Zapier, right? So Zapier is the middleman. So if you've got, say, QuickBooks, and you use QuickBooks, and you want your Pipeline data to be sent over there, you can do that, right? If you use Gmail and you want your Pipeline data to trigger an email every time, let's say, a transaction closes, you want an email to be sent, you can use Zapier to do that. So it helps connect different systems, hundreds of different systems that exist, and Pipeline is one of those that can sit on one side. So given that, since Pipeline uses transaction statuses to trigger when information goes from Pipeline to another system that you specify, your statuses are critical for that, right? So right now, a lot of people use that connection to say when a transaction is closed, do some action in another system. But you could use your statuses creatively, right? Since it's based on a transaction state, since the trigger of when information is sent from Pipeline to the other system is based on a transaction status change, you can use your statuses creatively, right? So you might want to even create an additional status if it fits into your workflow, right? We don't want you creating statuses just to send something over to another system, right? Just to have Zapier trigger sending it. But you can get creative if it falls into your workflow to use that as a trigger to send something to that other system, whatever that system may be, right? So it could be that I create a status called, let's say, closed with home warranty. We'll sort of double up this purpose here, because there are other benefits for setting something with closed with home warranty. Let's say when it's closed with home warranty, I want to send an email to a particular person, right? Instead of just plain closed, right? So it adds a little more detail. Maybe it's closed with some other contingency, or I shouldn't use that word, that's used for something else, but closed with some other scenario. And then that'll trigger an email to go to something, or maybe trigger some data to go to a spreadsheet, a Google Sheet, or something like that, okay? But again, don't want you necessarily to use it just to trigger to send to Zapier, because then that just adds an extra step for you. It could be that you forget to send it to the next status, etc. But again, if it fits into your workflow and can also trigger something to be sent to another system, that can be beneficial for you. All right. Also, sort of doubling up on this example here, closed with home warranty, you could want to track certain scenarios separately, maybe not just closed, but closed with home warranty, or again, closed with some other scenario, because you want to report on those later, or report on those separately later, and get that information discerned, okay? So again, you can use those creatively throughout. It doesn't have to necessarily be closed. It could be pending. You see these are broken down here. I've got pending inspection, under contract, maybe ready for broker review, etc. So the reason we've got these statuses set as custom statuses is because we want them to both fit your terminology, but also fit your need and your workflow, right? So allow them to sort of help drive what needs to get done. That's their purpose, is to identify the status of a transaction. If there's something that's pending or that needs to get done, that can be reflected in the status as well. Okay. And I'll use that as a segue for reporting, right? So when I'm, let's say on my transactions list here, and I want to report on certain criteria, obviously one of them is statuses. And that's where here I could say I'm looking for all my closed account warranty, right? And maybe some additional criteria, and I can search for that. And of course, I'll just give a little plug for our upcoming feature, which is once you've run that search, if it's one that you run regularly, you'll, after our next release, be able to save that search as a custom shortcut and be able to access that easily. So obviously, statuses is one of the criteria that you can search by. So that'll be something that'll be useful to save later if it's helpful for you. All right. While we're still on reporting, just wanted to mention, you probably have already noticed, but some people don't realize that when you are searching, you've got the ability to filter based on a particular status, or you can search on the entire status, right? So here I'm selecting closed, but if I hover over the actual category, I can search everything that has any closed status, right? Anything in that category. And then when I search, it'll show me all of the transactions. Hopefully we've got one here. Let me do a different one. Let's go pending. It'll show me all the statuses within that category. Okay, so you don't have to search a specific category. It can be, a specific status. It can be the entire category. Okay. And the last area I want to show you revolves around permissions. So first, if you go under admin settings, you've got the ability to specify whether you want to allow agents to change transaction statuses to closed, terminated, or expired, basically set them as inactive. Some offices don't want to allow agents to close a transaction. That's something they want the admins to do. So you've got the ability to set that globally so that agents cannot do that. To change statuses in general, they still need to have the change status, I think is the official name, the change status permission under manage users. But even if they have that, if you set this to not, or deselect this so that they're not allowed to change it to closed, even those with that ability to change permissions will not be able to change it to closed. Okay, so just a heads up there. And last thing is over on our help site. Just so that you're informed about how agents are or are not able to change transactions based on permissions. There's a limit, a beneficial limitation here, where agents are only able to change certain information depending on what status the transaction is in. And this article is called "Why Can't Agents Change Some Fields on Their Transactions?" Feel free to look this up. Even though we know the rules, there are so many of them, it's easy to forget sometimes. So we even refer to this to refresh our memories as far as when agents can change certain fields. And it's dependent on, again, what status the transaction is in. Specifically, these fields below can only be modified if the transaction is in an active listing or pending status, meaning one of those categories, right? They can change these particular fields. Once it goes to a status that's beyond those categories, then agents cannot change those fields here. Okay, and that's by design and has worked out well as far as limiting what they're able to change so that it doesn't alarm the admins seeing information that's changed after the fact that isn't supposed to be. All right, and that's all we've got for today's webinar.